Good to see everybody's faces. You guys doing well? Fantastic. I love this book, unironically. And we're going to look at the book of Leviticus tonight. This is probably the book, other than Psalms, that I've spent the most time studying of any of the books in the Bible, and I'm really excited to jump in with you. If you're watching online, you're a champion. And if you're watching this video in the future, you are an absolute icon for clicking on this basically unclickable title. And I love that. So let's look at this book together. Here's the different sections of the Bible. We have God's law. We're going all the way through the Bible together. And we'll be looking at this large wooden chart over here at the end of our time together. We're looking through the 5 books of the Pentateuch. The first 5 books of the Bible, the books of Moses, the ones that Moses wrote, and this one is the third one. This is easily the least popular book in the Bible. J. Sidlow Baxter said that Leviticus is obviously not meant just to be read, but to be studied. And that's a key for understanding the book of Leviticus. One of the keys for understanding the book is that it's not a novel. And you don't read it like a novel. You don't read it the same way that you read the Gospel of John or the book of Psalms. If you do read it that way, you'll be frustrated and you will feel like it is boring or irrelevant or something different. But if you read it, study it for the purposes for which it existed, it's closer to a reference book or a cookbook. You wouldn't open up a reference book like an encyclopedia and start reading it and be like, this is trash. Like, this is the worst book. This is so much worse than Lord of the Rings or whatever. You wouldn't do that. You wouldn't open up a cookbook and start reading it and be like, oh, this is so boring. You would recognize that what that book is there for is the information that it contains. And so you read informational content differently than you would read a novel. And Leviticus is based around the Hebrew idea of a chiasm. Here is the outline of the book of Leviticus. And what you'll notice in the outline is that the first and last sections are the same. The second and 6th sections are the same. And the 3rd and 5th sections are the same. Not the same as in contains the same content, but they go over the same themes. This is because the book of Leviticus is structured like a chiasm. What a chiasm is it is a Hebrew thought pattern where the portions mirror each other in almost exactly the same amount of content to put the focus on the center of what is happening. We would think typically like a film or a book, which the ending is always the most important, you know? Like everything in Star Wars happens for the end of each movie. The whole thing is good, but, well, not the sequels, but the whole thing is good, but that they're about getting to the end. And in Leviticus, it's not like that. It's a chiasm. There's a lot of chiasms in the book of Psalms, which is why sometimes you're like, well, they're just repeating the stuff they said at the beginning. Yeah, exactly. Because the idea is to push your focus to what is happening in the center. And the center is the pivotal part of any chiasm or chiastic structure. And the center of the book of Leviticus, the peak of the chiasm, is the Day of Atonement. So we're going to get there. We're going to get there today. The first section of Leviticus chapters 1 through 7 is about rhythmic obedience for close proximity. What I mean by that is there are practices that are given in this handbook to the priests. The book of Leviticus is a priest handbook. I even saw one theologian went so far as to say that he thought that some of the documents that were collected in this book were actually printed materials that were printed on the outside or around the tabernacle. So he is saying that he thinks that they were collected then and put into, by Moses, put into, by the Holy Spirit, the Old Testament as a record of what had taken place or what God was saying. It's also important to remember that God didn't invent sacrifices. People were already doing sacrifices in the ancient Near East, and God did not want them to sacrifice to the golden calf. He did not want them to sacrifice to demons. So functionally, when you're reading through Genesis, Exodus, and Leviticus, you can see, like we learned last week, that each time there's an extensive set of laws, It is around a narrative where the people completely screwed up something that they had already been told. And so the laws are meant to boundary them into good behavior in that sense. So in that sense, you could say that it was not God's original intent to even write the book of Leviticus. The reason that God wrote this book was because the people had done some of the things that we saw, the golden calf, these different things. We saw in the book of Exodus that God wanted the whole nation to be a nation of priests, but now he's realizing that's not going to happen. And so he is doing this version of his plan that is, you can't do it like the people in Egypt or Canaan. This is the way we are going to worship God. There are 5 different offerings in Leviticus chapters 1 through 7. There is a burnt offering, a grain offering, a peace offering, a sin offering, and a guilt offering. And all of them have different animals that are acceptable for the sacrifice. Sacrifices also point towards Jesus on the cross in the same way that communion points back to it. Additionally to that, there is a specific way that the Holy Spirit through Moses told people to hold their hands in each one of the sacrifices. On the animal, open. On the head of the animal, open and surrender. These are all for specific purposes. If you're an absolute theological masochist and you want to study this more in depth, I have a 7-hour course that goes through every single verse in all of Leviticus. And it is one of my worst performing series on YouTube. Just the performance, the YouTube stats are absolutely abysmal on these videos. And so I would love for you to watch those if that would be a blessing to you. I go through all of the offerings, exactly what they are, exactly why they were there. And there's a ton of interesting stuff in them. There's a ton of interesting stuff in this content. I don't have time to do all of it today because this is just an overview of the book of Leviticus, but there's a bunch of really intriguing things in these. We see pictures of Christ in each one of these ideas. We also see repeating phrases. We see the repeating phrase, a pleasing aroma to God. That's teaching us something about the character of God, who God is, and what God likes. We also see the repeating idea in the grain offering of don't forsake the salt of the covenant, which is intriguing because the grain offering was actually not completely burned. The grain offering was actually given to the priests to eat. And God included that a part of the covenant was to make sure you salt the bread so it's actually good, to make sure it's actually of a high quality. And there's a bunch of really cool, really interesting things in there. The second section in the book of Leviticus is the section on the priests. And we see a ton of stuff in this section. Part of it is culminating from some of these prophetic words that have already come about the Levites. The priests were from the tribe of Levi. There were 12 tribes from the 12 kids or a couple grandkids of Jacob, who God changed his name to Israel. And in Genesis chapter 49, there's a prophecy, there is a cursing on Levi from Jacob that says, gather so I may tell you what will happen in the coming days. We see in the book of Joshua that their inheritance was the temple, but we haven't gotten there yet. They're intriguing. The people of Levi do not have a land in Israel once they get there because God is their portion. And they are the focus of the book of Leviticus, of course. That's where the word comes from, Levite-ikus. That's where the word comes from in the title. And this is for them. We move to a slightly narrative portion in chapters 8 through 10. We see a bunch of different things in here. There is Urim and Thummim, which is one of the most interesting things in the Bible, which is that in the priestly uniform, they would have these little stones that we would think of kind of like dice. And if they didn't hear from God, they were allowed to make a decision based on the way that these stones came down. We see them being commissioned with a drop of blood on their right ear, on their right thumb, and on their right toe. And this is talking about being the type of priest who would listen to God, work for God, and walk with God. And then we have this absolutely horrifying narrative. What we see is Aaron is the main priest, and we see his sons rush into the Holy of Holies where no one was supposed to go except for once a year. And not only did they rush in there without permission, but it says that they offered, quote, strange fire to the Lord, which basically means these guys had these little sensors, these little metal things on the end of poles, and they would put the incense in them. And if you don't know what incense is, just ask someone at your table who smoked pot in high school, and they'll tell you. And they put the incense in them, they would light that, and then the cloud would come up from the incense, and it was part of the way that God told them to worship. And I think from what is happening in the text, you can see in chapters 16 and in chapter 10, they mention this idea of don't serve the Lord when you're drunk, is kind of this idea. I think that what is being stated is that these guys were hammered and they were rushing into the Holy of Holies and just being insane, and God chose to strike them dead because of that, to teach the people something about holiness. And in addition to that, you also see why the book of Leviticus is necessary, and I'm gonna get to a big key element as to why it's so specific in just a few minutes, so just hold on for that. The next section is chapters 11 through 15, and it goes into this idea of clean or unclean. So this would kind of be like the typical section that people would think of when they think of Leviticus, what Leviticus is like, what the sentences and verses are like. This would be the part that people think of the most. We have a chapter on clean eating, clean birthing, clean bodies, clean prophecy, which is great, and then clean discharge, which is easily one of the most graphic, perhaps, passages in the whole Bible. And we see that this use of Hebrew in chapter 11, it's divided into 6 sections that are marked by the word these or this. So you can see this organizational structure that makes it seem like a handbook or a guidebook. Again, not a narrative novel, but a handbook or a guidebook to teach you something. And the concept of clean or unclean is not new. It's not new in the book of Leviticus. Remember, that's how they decided on the animals in the Noah narrative. And it was, we've seen, the point is we've seen that already. And this idea is echoed in 1 Peter when he alludes to this section when he says, be holy because I am holy. And there's some interesting parts in this, like I don't think that we in America in 2025 need the book of Leviticus to tell us not to eat a dog or an eagle. If you ate a dog or an eagle this week, I would highly encourage you not to tell anyone at your table. And so it goes through these sections, and the general idea is do these things in this way. Why is God saying do these things in this way? These are not random laws. There is a repeating phrase that happens all throughout the Pentateuch that once you see it, it's like 5 or 6 times in the book of Leviticus. Once you see it, you start to get what God was going for and why he was giving all these specific laws in this way. And the specific idea, and we're gonna come back to this later, is don't do the things they did in Egypt. Don't do the things they do in Canaan. Egypt's where they're coming from, Canaan is where they're going. In fact, specifically, one of the times it says that, it says, quote, they did all these things. So when you get to these chapters, like chapter 15, that are talking about discharge, sexuality, when you get to the chapter that's talking about sexuality in and around the tabernacle, you're just like, this is so weird. Like, I've been to so many churches and none of them ever said you can't like have sex at church. And it's just so weird, it feels so weird. The reason is because these are the things they were seeing in that culture. They were seeing pagan sex cults in Egypt. They were going to see pagan sex cults in Canaan. So what God was doing was he was saying, not randomly, don't do these things. Don't do the specific things that you have seen other people do. There's also super random, brilliant stuff. Like there's this little like how-to manual in chapter 14 for leprosy. And it's this little like do this thing in this way with these two birds and this earthenware vessel and this water and this blood, and tie one of the birds to a piece of wood with a scarlet thread. And you're reading it and you're like, oh my gosh, this is like the clearest picture of Jesus in the entire Old Testament. It's this beautiful, beautiful picture of Jesus' earthly body being crushed and his spiritual self remaining completely, perfectly unscathed because one of the birds gets sent out free. In addition to that, you see this idea of this hyssop plant, which is something that David talks about in Psalm chapter 57. And this is the kind of stuff that, like, when I'm talking about it in like natural conversation, I can just hear people like tuning out. But it's really, go read Leviticus 14 sometime and you'll see it. It's right there. It's right there in the text. It's all right there. Then in chapter 13 and 15, we get laws and rituals for purification. And so I wanted to talk about this. I already talked about it briefly because I think it's really important to understand the book. But chapter 15 is kind of like a really specific example. It talks about circumcision a lot in chapter 13. But when we get here to chapter 15, we come face to face with kind of like the general 2025 Christian mentality of like, what is this content? Like, why is this content here? Like, what is the purpose of this? And so some people have taken the thread of, you know what? This content, I don't like it. So it's allegorical, meaning everything in the text means something different. Everything is a representation of something different. So they take the way that you would read chapter 14 and they apply that to everything. So like everything means something different. This is the way like some of the church fathers like Jerome and other people interpreted the Old Testament. And it's incorrect because that's not the way the New Testament uses Leviticus for one reason, but it's also just not correct. And then some people have taken it to be like, okay, it's like a health code. It's like these people were dumb and they didn't know what they were doing, so God was teaching them how to be alive. And I think that's a little bit insulting, considering that like the majority of us are like mentally ill and full of microplastics. Like I don't think the people in the past were dumb and we are smart. If anything, it's the opposite of that. And so I think I don't like that interpretation, that interpretational grid. The key is out of Egypt. We see that in chapter 11, 18, 19, 22, 23, 24, and 26. And I chose a different key verse for Leviticus, but I think I've gone back and forth. I chose a key verse about holiness, but I sometimes think that the key verse to understand this book is chapter 18, verse 3, which is, you shouldn't do as they did in the land of Egypt where you lived. You shouldn't do as they did in Canaan. And it goes on and on and on about that in chapter 18. There's a bunch of great stuff there. You shall follow my rules, keep my statutes. You shall not walk in their statutes. If you keep my statutes, you will live by them. This is what I think is actually functionally going on in this book. And then we get to the center of the chiasm, which is the Day of Atonement. And it is a beautiful holiday that God has started, and they still celebrate it in Israel to this day. It's called Yom Kippur. That's the Day of Atonement, and it's about 6 months after Passover and all of the feasts right around Passover. And the Day of Atonement is the day that Aaron could enter the most holy place in the tabernacle. And it's a really intriguing day. He would get 2 goats. One of them would be offered as a sacrifice. The other one, he would stand at the front of the tabernacle and put his hands on the horns and start yelling out all of the sins of the people. And they didn't have like phones or entertainment, obviously. So when I'm reading this, I'm picturing people standing there watching this. Kind of like the way we would watch like the lighting of a tree or something at Christmas. It's like, it's not technically interesting, but it's cool and we do it every year and it's like a thing, right? I picture people being like, oh, it's the Day of Atonement. We're gonna listen to this. And so Aaron, the high priest, has got his hands on this goat horns and he's yelling out all of these sins. And then they let the goat go out into the wilderness. There's an additional part of this, which if you're like on TikTok at 3 a.m, it's gonna tell you, it's like a key element of this, but it's really not, is this word that they use in chapter 16 called Azazel. And so what some people do is they take this word and they're like, okay, this is what this means. This means Azazel is a demon, and it means that they were offering one of the goats to God and one of the goats to a demon, which is not a real thing, and it is not a thing that would happen. Azazel is a transliteration of the word goat, going. That's all that it is. So it gets a lot of press in kind of those like those internet spaces where like nothing is real and the only point is to like shock and terrify people. And so it's just kind of, I talk about that way more when I did a whole video on chapter 16, and it's an hour long. I'd love it if you would check that out sometime. I think some people would get to this part about the Day of Atonement and they would be really intrigued because they would think, oh my gosh, you're Christians, you're looking back, right? You'd think, oh my gosh, like they're instituting the Day of Atonement. This must be the day that Jesus died, but it is not. Jesus died on what holiday? Passover, exactly. And we're gonna get into why that is when we get to chapter 23, because chapter 23 is amazing. Leviticus 23 is so incredible, and we're gonna talk all about that. But I made this meme about it. I bet he's thinking about other women. The guy's thinking, why did Jesus die on Passover and not the Day of Atonement? Okay, so then we get into the rest of the holiness codes, clean or unclean, in chapters 17 through 20. And there is a bunch of things about that, like they use the word Kadesh, the Hebrew word, a ton of times. They use it 70 times in this section, so it's clearly like a pretty big deal. They get into this repetitive section where it's like, don't uncover your father's nakedness, don't uncover your mother's nakedness, don't uncover your father's sister's nakedness. And it seems kind of laborious and kind of confusing when you read it. But the thing you have to understand about that is that uncovering nakedness in Hebrew is a euphemism, and it is a euphemism for like a sex act. And the reason that the Bible uses that euphemism is the same reason that we use euphemisms today. Like we would say something like, oh, they slept together, two people slept together, right? We perhaps would not describe graphically the sexual act that's taking place between two people because we're normal and not psychotic. And so we would feel more comfortable using euphemism. That's what the Bible does too. And when you understand that uncovered nakedness is a euphemism, it starts to put a lot of the things in the Pentateuch in like the correct hallway for what they actually mean. Because when you get to the narrative of Noah and Ham at the end of the flood narrative in Genesis, it's kind of confusing. And the reason it's kind of confusing is because you're like, I thought Noah was amazing, but then he's like obliterated, drunk, laying naked in a tent, and then somehow Ham is the one getting condemned for this. And you're like, what on earth is going on? Like, that is a very weird chapter, but it's actually not. It's actually a really pivotal chapter in the entire Pentateuch, because what's happening is everyone is gonna come from Noah, because Noah is the new B version of Adam, right? And so Noah has 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and the Jewish people are gonna come from Shem's line. And God is trying to explain where the incredibly perverse practices of the people of Canaan came from. The people of Canaan came from Ham. That's where they came. And so it gives this narrative of like, man, I wonder if the promise to Adam and Eve is already coming true. I wonder if the flood has destroyed the devil and now it's just going to be amazing. So it's serving that purpose by showing, no, there's still sin in the world. It's also serving the purpose of expressing what actually happened in that story, which the word for saw, when it says Ham saw his father's uncovered nakedness, the word there for saw is gaze. And so you can take that in a number of ways, but in the context of what is happening in the Pentateuch, the general idea is that he was gazing at some sort of sexual activity. And there's no need to be more specific than that. That's all the text says, but it puts it into perspective what's actually going on and what they're actually teaching you about what is going on in these different groups. There's also this really intriguing part in Leviticus where it says the land will get sick and vomit. It's like the land will be like a college student who's eaten a ton of Taco Bell at 2 a.m. It will get sick. And this is kind of a precursor to everything that happens in the book of Deuteronomy, because it is this repeat idea that, hey, you're about to go into this land and it is yours as long as you obey the covenant. As long as you obey the covenant. The key repeating phrase in Deuteronomy is obey and be blessed, disobey and be cursed. And so we are seeing these types of things. And these are not like the easiest passages to teach from necessarily. They're actually pretty difficult to teach from. Also interestingly, when you get to chapter 19, which is kind of one of the most searched for chapters in Leviticus because it contains the content on human sexuality and homosexuality. And there's this really intriguing, sad article with an interview with Ian McKellen, Gandalf himself, and he said in this interview that every single time he stays in a hotel room anywhere in the world, he opens the Bible in the drawer next to his bed and rips Leviticus 19 out of the Bible and then throws it away and then puts the Bible back in there. I thought that was intriguing. That's his reaction to, his openly stated reaction to the content of Leviticus 19. And so every time I go to a hotel room, I open up the Bible to Leviticus 19 just to see if Ian McKellen stayed there. And I'm 0 for whatever so far. So then we move to the section that shows us the final section, which matches the first section, which is more rhythmic obedience for close proximity. And I love chapter 23. It's so amazing. One of my professors in college spent so much time explaining this passage to us, and we spent so much class time talking about it, and I really appreciated that teaching and all of the stuff that I learned from it. But what we see in Leviticus chapter 23 is a prophetic calendar. What that means is God was saying like, hey, here's how it's gonna go. Like if we were talking at church, like now, we would say like the calendar is like, we go every week and there's Easter and Good Friday and then like a big launch of like a new idea in January, or like when people go back to school and then we talk about gratitude at Thanksgiving maybe, and we talk about Christmas, talk about Jesus being born at Christmas, right? Like that's be like normal year at church, right? Like we all stop going in the summer because like it hot or whatever. And this is what that is, but it's even more intriguing because Leviticus 23 is a prophetic calendar. Because all of the holidays that happen, all of the 7 holidays in Israel are all a picture of something that happens in the future. And this is obvious. This is like plainly stated repeatedly in the New Testament. Because we see Passover, they're talking about Passover. And interestingly enough, Passover, unleavened bread, and first fruits all happen within 3 days. They are 3 days in a row in the Jewish calendar. Now, what happened on those days? Jesus was crucified literally on Passover. He literally was crucified on Passover. He literally was buried in the ground. Not that wasn't the day he was buried, but that was the day that he was buried, if that makes sense. Like the day that he was there is the day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And the Feast of First Fruits is the day after that. Jesus literally rose from the dead on the day of the Feast of First Fruits. And it's even more interesting than that, because the first Passover is in the book of Exodus. That's when they left Egypt. So they go through Passover, unleavened bread, first fruits, the first time. 40 days later is the Feast of Weeks. The first time 40 days after the first Feast of First Fruits in the book of Exodus is literally the day that they crossed the Red Sea. That's literally the day that happened. And then God instituted in Leviticus that day was going to be called the Feast of Weeks. 40 days after Jesus rose from the dead is Acts chapter 2. That's Pentecost. So the day that Jesus rose from the dead is on the Feast of First Fruits. The day of the Feast of Weeks is the same day that the Jewish people walked through the Dead Sea on dry ground. The first Feast of Weeks after Jesus died and rose again is literally Pentecost. And that's what the church all around the world celebrates as Pentecost Sunday. And what is the Holy Spirit described as? This living water that flows from within. It matches the patterns of what was happening in the book of Exodus and in the book of Leviticus. Then the final three are all three that have not had their fulfillment yet. That's what makes Leviticus 23 so interesting. When it was written, 7 holidays. When the New Testament was finished, 7 holidays, 4 of them have Christian meanings that are obvious right now. 3 of them have Christian meanings that we don't see yet and can't see yet, but we do know what they're going to be because we can just see it super clearly. The Feast of Trumpets in Leviticus 23 is in the fall. It's the first day of the 7th month. And what do we know from the book of Revelation? What is marked with trumpets? What do we know from Thessalonians? The return of Christ is marked with trumpets. So this is a 3,400 year festival. Be the return of Christ. The Day of Atonement is illustrative of the wedding supper of the Lamb from Revelation chapter 19. The Feast of Booths is the really cool one where they go camping. Have you guys read this? It's great. Any guys out there like camping? You'd love the Feast of Booths. I don't like camping at all because it is a downgrade of everything that I like about life. So it is like, hey, what if your bed was worse? Temperature, worse. To me, I'd like to go sit at a campfire and then hop in an RV and go to bed. That's my style of glamping because I am posh and a loser. And so the Feast of Booths is illustrative of heaven when God will dwell among us, which many people say is the example of everything that happens in the Bible. Here's my brother calling me. Hey, I'm teaching the Bible study. I'll call you back. Yeah, what's up? My nephew scored 26 points and won the game in quadruple overtime. That is incredible. Which one? Carter, straight dubs. What a legend. All right, I'll see you when I call you back and you don't pick up. So there's also some other ideas that are like repeated in this section of Leviticus. Like this eye for an eye idea is here. The idea of Jubilee is here in this section. Chapters 20 through 22, I summarized there. An eye for an eye is one that a lot of people talk about because Jesus talked about it. And this one little thing that I will teach you, I think will really help you understand, because it's a thing that really trips people up and gets confusing. Because the Old Testament, Leviticus says punishment for crimes, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. And Jesus said, turn the other cheek, right? So people would say that is a contradiction. Or I was sitting in high school math class in geometry, and I remember a kid saying that in class, like during a discussion time. He was like, this is why the Bible contradicts itself or whatever. And the reason it's not a contradiction is, I think, fairly obvious, but an eye for an eye is a limiting principle on vengeance. It is not a maximizing principle. An eye for an eye isn't saying, yeah, if somebody stabs you in the eye, go stab them in the eye. An eye for an eye is saying, if someone stabs you in the eye, don't do more than this. It is a limiting principle. And so Jesus is saying, he references this text in Matthew chapter 5. He references Leviticus, and he says, you've heard it said an eye for an eye. Like, if you want to take revenge, okay, but don't do more than what the person did to you. If they punch you, you can punch them back. That's it. Jesus said, how about like 1,000 times further than that? How about if someone punches you, not only do you not punch them back, but you turn the other cheek so that they can hit you again. Jesus is not saying this is a bad principle and reversing it. Jesus is saying this is a limiting principle. What if you took it all the way to its conclusion? That's the idea. And then there's also this idea of Jubilee, which is beautiful. There's a lot of numbers in the Bible, and they had this thing they had to do in the Old Testament where they would do 6 years of planting and then 1 year of letting the land rest. And the people of Israel never did that. They completely disobeyed that, as far as we can tell, literally every single time. But there was a really cool part when it got to the 7th 7. So 6 years planting, 1 year of letting the land rest, 7 years. Do that 7 times, you're at 49 years. The 50th year is an additional thing, and it's the year of Jubilee. And it's a beautiful idea, and the idea is that you would set free any indentured servants. The Bible uses the term slave. I think that's confusing because of American slavery, because the Bible does not commend slavery like that at all. What it commends is people who had no money and were going to die to death of hunger, being able to give their entire family to another family in order to live, and then they would have to work for the family. And then in the year of Jubilee, everyone gets set free, and you couldn't purchase any land for longer than that period of time. It was Jubilee is keeping Israel from becoming an oligarchy, is really what it is. The idea is the rich can't continue to enrich themselves at the expense of all of the poor people. There is a limit, there is a biblical limit to that, which, I think very right-wing on a lot of things. That is a very left-wing idea that is actually a really beautiful idea. Bro, please stop making fun of Leviticus, bro. It literally has a whole chapter about feasts. It's really cool. Jesus quotes it a couple of times. Bro, please stop. This is Christians when Leviticus finally clicks. This is you when you finish reading Leviticus. I'm something of an absolute legend myself. I think the main criticisms of Leviticus are that it is boring and irrelevant, and I think that is because people read it looking for their Jesus' time and they think the Bible is about them. If you think the Bible is about you, you're never going to understand what Leviticus is about. The Bible is not about us. The Bible is about God. And we are characters in it, but we are some of the villains. We come in about 3/4 of the way through, but even we can be saved. The Bible's not about us. The Bible's about God. And when we think that way, it is amazing to read 27 chapters of what God thinks about holiness and how God is not going to let people worship a pagan demon golden calf. He's going to instead again be merciful to them and tell them how they can live in communion with him. Because Leviticus is like another try at Eden. In Eden, God wanted to live with his people forever, and they keep screwing it up, and he keeps coming back with more plans of how we can live together in harmony. And that's the solution of Revelation, is that God, Jesus, paid for all of the sin. He has defeated evil, condemned evil to hell, and we will live with God forever. Leviticus is a part of the journey to that end. And I would say that it is brilliant and prescient, not boring and irrelevant. And I got some more memes for you. Read through the Bible in a year plans, get derailed by Leviticus, and wake up, babe, new Leviticus Bible study dropped. Here's another one, waiting for a church to teach through Leviticus verse by verse. Okay, do we have any questions? If you have a question in the room, you can raise your hand. And Blake is going to run over. I see Greg has his hand up over here. So let's see if we have any questions on the internet. See, that wasn't too bad, was it? That wasn't too bad. Right? Hello, Greg.
What up? I had read through Leviticus on my own before this, like fairly recently, and I had two questions. One is very general. The other one is more specific. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of laws in Leviticus, obviously, and some of those we follow today, like the moral laws, and others we are not under, like the ceremonial or the traditional laws. I was trying to figure out, where is the line between knowing if a law is moral and if a law is ceremonial or traditional?
Yeah, that's kind of like the typical way that people talk about it. I don't see it like that. We are not under the law at all. The New Testament says of the Old Testament, these things happened as an example to you, that you would not sin as they did. So the reason I obey some of the things in Leviticus and don't obey other things is because of the things that the New Testament teaches us to obey in the covenant that we are in with Jesus. I don't obey them because they're in Leviticus or not in Leviticus or ceremonial or not or moral or not. I obey them because they're what Jesus taught and what Paul taught in the New Testament. What Jesus said, he said, I haven't come to abolish the law and the prophets. I have come to fulfill them. And that's what I was getting at the table question last week, that it seemed like maybe I didn't write it well or something, but the reason I obey the 10 commandments is not because they're the 10 commandments, but because all 10 of them are reiterated as a part of the new covenant with Jesus Christ. That's the covenant that I'm a part of. And Acts chapter 10 says, rise, Peter, kill and eat. He's like, Peter, there's this thing. It's called bacon. And you're gonna love it. And so that I think is the reason. And I see Christians getting annihilated by atheists in discussion forums all the time because they're like, don't be gay, Leviticus 19. And then the person always replies back, do you wear a cotton poly blend t-shirt? Because what the person is mocking them for is the fact that they don't even understand the hermeneutic of their own book. We don't obey the morality code of sexuality because it's in Leviticus 19. We obey it because it's what Jesus taught. Jesus commended traditional man and woman marriage according to the laws of Moses Paul made it super clear in Romans chapter 1 and other places, and that's why we obey that, even if that's a struggle for us. If that's a struggle for us, we all have struggles in those areas, but we lean into the truth of what Jesus said for that purpose. That's the way that I see it.
Yeah, that was really well spoken.
Good, thank you. Do you have a mustache and a mullet?
Yeah.
Wow. Wow.
The mustache is coming back.
Most people would only pick one of those.
No, I like the best of both worlds.
Yeah.
And then my second question, which you mostly answered it, but I'd still like a more specific answer just because I like clarity. In Leviticus, it talks about a Sabbath, which, we're supposed to follow on the seventh day, just where we find our rest. But then it also talks about a Sabbath year, where we work for 6 years, and then for one whole year, the land goes untilled so that it can regrow and be healthy and stuff. So, I mean, it doesn't ever talk about a Sabbath year in the New Testament with the covenant of Jesus. What are your thoughts on the Sabbath year?
Yeah, I think it's cool and interesting. And I think that it is just a part of us learning about God and his unfolding plan is the way I view things like that. It has no binding on us of any kind. I would assume, like many of the things in the Bible, there's some sort of farming principle that they have now discovered is amazing for fields or seeds or something. But that's not why God told them to do it, but it is why God programmed the world to work that way, if that makes sense.
Word.
Yeah. Okay, anybody else? Thank you for the question. Okay, we have some online. It's time for Leviticus. Good luck, soldiers. This is from Trevor. Leviticus reminds me of instructions when you buy something that you don't read. That's so funny. Greetings from Paraguay, South America. Oh, you love to see it. You love to see it. Leviticus is that bad so far. Okay. Well, no one's making you watch it, big guy. You nailed camping. It is such a downgrade. So true. So true. Camping is like the running of outdoor hobbies. It's like, we get it. You're strong enough emotionally to handle this. Cool, man. From Jagab, Leviticus explicitly says in chapter 7, verse 36, it's a statute forever throughout your generations. And then we have the New Testament saying in Romans that Christ is the end of the law. How is that not a contradiction? Well, that's a great question. I appreciate that question. The translation that I have doesn't say that in chapter 7, verse 36. It says that it is a law throughout your generations. And so the way that I see it would be saying this is a Jewish command. There are other times that it says this is a law for you forever. And that it says that in the Passover narrative. That's why I think Christians should keep Passover and remember Good Friday and do that. Doesn't mean you have to dip parsley in salt water and think about tears, even though I do think you should do that. I don't necessarily think you have to. I think it's more of a remembrance idea. And when it says that Christ is the end of the law, it does not mean the destruction of the law. It means the fulfillment of the law. Remember what it says in Acts chapter 13. It says, Jesus Christ frees everyone from everything that you could not be free from by the law of Moses. And so I would view it more as it's a part of it. And thank you for the question. That's a great question. I was told by pastors when we were in a conversation to look at the book of Little Leviticus as a book of worship. Do you feel that is a good view to take from Amanda? Yes, I do. Totally, in the sense that Levites are, kind of like worship leaders, except their worship was like barbecuing, which sounds kind of fun, honestly. That would be great if like one day a week I could just crank like just a huge reverse seared steak and be like, that was it. That was for God. But then I still get to eat it like some of the priests did. I think that'd be cool. Be into that. Okay, anybody else? Okay, fantastic. Thank you guys. There is one over here. Who's that, Mallory? That means it's gonna be a tough one.
Oh, no, this is easy. Okay, so something that, we read that they sacrifice hundreds of thousands of animals, or ox and sheep, and it's something that we have a hard time even grasping our minds around. Okay, they brought 120,000 oxen to slaughter. Is that all in one day, or is that just weeks worth? I mean, if that was occurring now, that would be nationwide news of something that, maybe not nationwide news, but we do that with chickens and pigs now. But we read that so quickly and skim over it, and I'm like, what would that actually look like back then?
Yeah, I mean, there was so many sheep getting sacrificed in Jerusalem that they built an addendum into the city that's called the Sheep Gate, because they were bringing so many animals into the city that someone was saying at some point, like, dude, we need like a sheep entrance, because I keep tripping over sheep that are about to get sacrificed when I'm trying to, go to the Wailing Wall or whatever that guy was doing. And so, yes. Did it all happen in one day? I don't know. It's
like mind-blowing to think about.
Yeah.
Yeah,
it is.
And gruesome. Like bloody and smelly. Once they start cooking it or burning it, maybe.
Why would it be
good.
smelly?
All of them before they die? Or like, what if they killed one and then it started to rot, Because there's so many.
Why would they do that, Mallory?
I don't know, because they clearly don't listen at all. I don't know. Maybe one got loose and they didn't realize it and it dies, and I'm just like, the logistics of this just sounds so much more grand than we just skim over in our reading.
Oh yeah, that reminds me of one thing I forgot, which is this thing I studied, which is really interesting, because a lot of times when it says they're going to sacrifice an animal in Leviticus, it says take out the liver and the lobe of the liver and set it aside. And I read something that was the reason that they did that was because livers from animals were used for divination in Egypt. And so they would say, okay, I'm going to marry this person if this animal liver is spotted, and I'm not going to marry them if the animal liver is not spotted. And so that's why God repeatedly said, put that away. We're not doing that stuff. We're doing it this way. Thank you for the question. Hope that helps. Okay, here's the questions for the table, everybody. And thank you guys so much for coming. Thanks to everybody for watching online. And we'll do the book of Numbers next week.